The night the propane stopped flowing and the grid went silent across Mineral County, 23 people stood shivering in the absolute dark of a Montana blizzard, staring at the only light left burning for 50 miles. A warm orange glow pulsing from deep inside an abandoned copper mine everyone had spent 18 months calling a death trap. The same mine shaft they'd reported to safety inspectors twice. The same one they demanded the county condemn. And the woman who'd converted it into something nobody understood stood at the entrance now, holding a lantern, her face unreadable as the temperature outside dropped past survivable and kept falling. But that moment came later, after everything collapsed. The story actually started in early spring, when Joanna Reese bought the old Blackwell mine property for almost nothing and immediately made the most mocked decision in town history. Nobody in Harlan Ridge could make sense of it. The mine had been closed since 1987, its tunnels partially flooded, its entrance boarded over with rotting plywood and warnings about structural collapse. The surrounding land was worthless, too rocky for farming, too isolated for development. Most people assumed Joanna, a quiet metalworker who'd moved to town 5 years earlier and kept mostly to herself, had been scammed by an out-of-state seller. But Joanna didn't act like someone who'd made a mistake. She hired a structural engineer from Billings who spent 3 days inside the mine with ground-penetrating radar and seismic sensors. Then she brought in a drilling crew to assess water tables. Then a mason to inspect the stone integrity of the main shaft. "She's actually going in there," someone said at the co-op, disbelief sharpening into concern. And she was. By summer, heavy equipment arrived: excavators, concrete mixers, steel I-beams on flatbed trucks. Joanna began reinforcing the mine entrance, pouring in new foundation, installing drainage systems to redirect groundwater away from the main tunnel. She worked methodically, often alone, hauling materials into the dark shaft day after day while the town washed with growing unease. "It's not safe," Margaret Driscoll said flatly at the diner one morning. She was a retired county clerk who treated her opinions like legal rulings. Those tunnels could collapse any second. Others agreed. The mine had flooded twice in the 90s. The timber supports were rotting. The whole structure was a lawsuit waiting to happen. But Joanna kept working. What bothered people most wasn't just that she was using the mine. It was what she was building inside it. Because instead of sealing it off or filling it in like any reasonable person would, Joanna was expanding it. She installed ventilation shafts that ran 300 feet to the surface, hidden among scrub pine where nobody would notice. She laid electrical conduit along the tunnel walls, though no power lines ran anywhere near the property. She poured concrete floors deep inside the shaft and framed out walls in spaces that hadn't seen light in decades. And then the forge arrived. It came on a trailer in late August, a massive coal-fed blacksmith forge with a hand-crank blower, the kind used before electricity existed. Joanna had it delivered to the mine entrance and spent 2 weeks installing it inside the main shaft, building a stone chimney that vented through one of her hidden exhaust pipes. That was when the jokes turned into genuine concern. "She's building a workshop inside a condemned mine," someone said at the hardware store, shaking his head. "That's not eccentric. That's dangerous." Margaret Driscoll filed a formal complaint with the county, citing safety hazards and potential environmental contamination. An inspector came out, walked the perimeter, and admitted the entrance met code, but strongly advised against occupying the interior. Joanna listened politely and kept working. By October, she'd moved her entire metalworking operation underground. Her welders, anvils, tool racks, propane torches, all of it disappeared into the mine. She installed a wood-burning stove near the forge for heat, stockpiled coal in a dry chamber she'd waterproofed with rubberized sealant, built storage shells that she filled with canned goods, water jugs, welding rods, sheet metal, bags of grain. "She's not just working in there," Ethan Cobb said to his wife one evening, watching Joanna's truck disappear down the access road. "She's preparing to live in there." And she was. Because Joanna had learned something years ago that nobody in Harlan Ridge seemed to remember. Winter in Montana wasn't a season. It was a test. And the systems people trusted, power grids, fuel deliveries, insulated homes, only worked until they didn't. She'd seen it before, back in 2019, when a week-long cold snap knocked out power across 3 counties and people burned furniture to stay warm. She'd watched neighbors who mocked preparedness stand in line for emergency shelters, humbled and freezing. So in the long-range models that autumn started showing something worse. A stalled Arctic system capable of locking the region into sub-zero temperatures for weeks. Joanna didn't wait for warnings. She sealed the mine entrance with a steel door set into reinforced concrete. She tested her ventilation under load. She fired the forge and let it run for 72 hours straight, monitoring how the heat distributed through the stone tunnels. And when the first snow fell in November, she stopped coming to town entirely. By mid-December, Harlan Ridge had mostly forgotten about her. Until the night the storm hit, and the power failed, and the cold became something that didn't stop. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. Not gradually, like a door slamming shut on the entire county. By the second night of the storm, Harlan Ridge had gone completely dark. Transformers froze and exploded in sequence down the valley. Backup generators ran for a few hours, then stalled as diesel gelled in fuel lines. The propane that heated most homes stopped flowing once regulators iced over, and no amount of thawing brought them back. Inside the Morrison house, 3 miles from town, the cold crept in like something alive. Ethan Cobb and his wife, Iris, layered every blanket they owned over their 2 daughters and huddled near a fireplace that couldn't keep up. The logs burned hot, but the heat vanished into walls that weren't built for this. Ice formed on the inside of the windows. Their breath hung visible in the air. "We can't stay here," Iris said quietly, so the girls wouldn't hear the fear in her voice. Ethan stared into the fire, trying to think of options. The nearest town with power was 60 miles away, across roads already buried under snow. The community center had no heat. The church had no generator. There was nowhere to go. Except the mine, he said. Iris looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "That death trap. She's been in there for weeks," Ethan said. "And her truck's still parked outside. If she's alive, she has heat." Iris hesitated. They'd both signed Margaret Driscoll's petition to get the mine condemned. They'd both laughed when someone joked that Joanna was building a doomsday bunker for the apocalypse. But their daughters were shivering under 4 blankets, and the fireplace was losing ground. They packed what they could carry and stepped into the storm. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked Ethan sideways. Snow drove horizontally across the road, erasing everything. They walked in near whiteout conditions, following the faint memory of where the access road should be, until finally they saw it. A dull orange glow coming from somewhere underground, pulsing faintly through the snow like a heartbeat. When they reached the mine entrance, Ethan pounded on the steel door with numb fists. For a long moment, nothing. Then a sound, metal sliding, locks turning. The door opened inward, and warm air poured out into the frozen night. Joanna stood there holding a lantern, her face streaked with cold dust, her expression calm. She looked at them for a long moment, taking in their frostbitten faces and the 2 small girls shivering behind them. Then she stepped aside. "Get in." The warmth inside was shocking. Not just heat, steady, deep, bone-warming heat that radiated from the stone walls themselves. The tunnel stretched back into the mountain, lit by oil lanterns hanging from iron hooks. 30 feet in, the main chamber opened up, and Ethan stopped dead. The forge burned at the center of the space, its coals glowing red-orange, heat rippling the air above it. Joanna had built the entire chamber around it, stone walls reinforced with steel, a vaulted ceiling that funneled smoke into the hidden chimney, a wood stove in the corner for cooking. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with food, water, tools, welding gear. Sleeping cots were set up in an alcove carved into the rock. It wasn't a death trap. It was a fortress. How? Iris started, but couldn't finish. "Stone holds heat," Joanna said simply. "The forge warms the air. The rock absorbs it and radiates it back. The whole tunnel system acts like thermal mass. As long as I have fuel, the temperature stays stable." Ethan stared at the forge, then at the tunnel stretching deeper into the mountain. "How long can you keep this running?" "Months," Joanna said. "I have 2 tons of coal, another cord of hardwood. The ventilation works. The water doesn't freeze this far down." She handed Iris a wool blanket and nodded toward the stove. "There's soup. Get them warm." Over the next 2 days, others arrived. Margaret Driscoll came first, shame written across her face as Joanna opened the door without a word. Then the Hendersons, whose pipes had burst and flooded their basement. Then Bill Archer, the hardware store owner who joked loudest about the crazy mine lady. Each time, Joanna let them in. No lectures. No I told you so. Just a quiet nod and a gesture toward the wharf. By the fourth night, 23 people were sheltering inside the mine. Joanna organized them with the same methodical precision she'd used to build the place. Sleeping rotations, cooking duties, coal management. The forge ran continuously, its heat soaking into the stone and spreading through the tunnels. Joanna worked it when needed, hammering out repairs, bending metal, keeping her hands busy while the storm raged outside. Margaret Driscoll watched her one evening, firelight reflecting off the tunnel walls. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew this was coming." Joanna didn't look up from the glowing coals. "I knew something would come eventually. Why didn't you warn anyone?" Joanna set down her hammer and finally met Margaret's eyes. "I did. You called it dangerous and tried to shut me down." Margaret looked away, the weight of that settling over her. Outside, the storm continued. But inside the mine, deep in the stone where the cold couldn't reach, the forge burned steady. The storm lasted 9 days. Long enough for the county to declare a state of emergency. Long enough for the National Guard to attempt supply drops that couldn't land because of the wind. Long enough for people inside the mine to stop thinking of it as temporary shelter and start understanding what Joanna had built, a system that didn't just survive winter, but ignored it entirely. The forge became the center of everything. Joanna tended it like a living thing, feeding coal in careful measures, adjusting airflow, using the heat not just for warmth but for purpose. When someone's glasses broke, she welded the frame. When a lantern failed, she fabricated a new bracket. When the Hendersons' youngest daughter grew sick with fever, Joanna heated water over the coals and showed Iris how to make a steam tent that eased the child's breathing. People who'd mocked her for months now watched her work with something close to awe. "You really did think of everything," Bill Archer said one evening, watching Joanna hammer a bent hinge back into shape. "I thought about what happens when everything else fails," Joanna corrected. "That's different." Ethan, who'd been helping manage the coal supply, asked the question everyone had been wondering. "How did you know to do this? Build it this way?" Joanna set down her tools and wiped soot from her hands. For a moment, she was quiet. "My grandfather was a miner," she said finally. "Worked underground for 40 years. He told me once that the safest place in a Montana winter isn't above ground trying to keep the cold out. It's below ground where the cold never reaches. The earth regulates itself. Stays the same temperature year-round once you go deep enough." She gestured at the tunnel walls. "This mine was already here. Already stable. I just gave it purpose." Margaret, sitting near the fire with a mug of tea, spoke quietly. "I'm sorry. For the complaints. For trying to shut you down." Joanna looked at her. "You were scared. People fear what they don't understand. We should have listened." "Maybe," Joanna said. "But you're listening now." On the 10th day, the wind finally stopped. The silence woke people before dawn, a sudden absence of sound so complete it felt unnatural. Joanna climbed to the entrance and opened the steel door. The world outside was unrecognizable. Snow had buried the landscape under 8-foot drifts that erased roads and fences. The sky was pale gray, empty, and in the distance, the faint sound of helicopter rotors. Rescue crews reached Harlan Ridge by midday. What they found shook them: collapsed roofs, frozen pipes, homes destroyed by cold. But they also found something unexpected: a mine entrance with smoke rising from a hidden chimney, and 23 people emerging healthy, warm, and alive. The story spread fast. News crews arrived within days. Reporters stood outside the mine, filming Joanna's forge, her ventilation system, her stockpiled supplies. Headlines called her a survivalist genius. Engineers from the state came to study her design. But Joanna avoided the cameras. She helped where she was needed, repairing equipment, welding broken tools for neighbors, sharing techniques she'd learned. When a university professor asked to interview her about disaster preparedness, she declined. "I'm not a teacher," she said. "I'm just someone who prepared." By spring, Harlan Ridge had changed. 3 families built root cellars with proper ventilation. The county updated its emergency protocols. Margaret Driscoll started a community preparedness group that met monthly at the library. And Joanna returned to her work in the mine, forging tools and hardware she sold quietly to ranchers and builders. The forge still burned most days, its warmth soaking into stone, ready. One afternoon, Ethan brought his daughters to visit. They watched, wide-eyed, as Joanna heated iron until it glowed and shaped it with ringing hammer blows. "Can you teach me?" his oldest asked. Joanna smiled. "Rare, but genuine. If you're willing to learn." She handed the girl a pair of safety gloves and showed her how to hold the hammer, how to strike with intention, how to respect the heat. Outside, spring wind moved through the pines. But deep in the mountain, the forge burned steady, patient, waiting. Because Joanna understood something the town was only beginning to grasp. Survival wasn't about predicting disaster. It was about being ready when certainty failed. And she would always be ready.